Kia ora koutou katoa and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for this session in the Thriving Cities webinar series. My name is Rachel Nepia and I'm the Program Manager for People, Cities and Nature, and I'll be your host today. This series explores what it means for cities in Aotearoa New Zealand to support truly thriving biodiversity and resilient urban ecosystems. And today's session is all about innovative tools and approaches to measuring urban biodiversity in Aotearoa New Zealand. Today we are so lucky to hear from two researchers from the University of Otago. First we'll hear from Yolanda van Heezik. Yolanda is a pioneer in urban ecology with extensive work on animal ecology and human-nature interactions. Her research informs policy and public understanding of urban biodiversity conservation. And with Yolanda today is her PhD student, Jacqui Theis. Jacqui is in the final stages of her research and she's been doing some incredible things with how to foster biodiversity in urban areas through inclusive and informed design. After both of those presentations, we'll have time for questions. So please use the Q&A function at any point during the webinar and we'll get to as many as we can at the end. So first up, Yolanda.
Well, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you, Rachel, too. This is an image of a typical Dunedin suburb, and until relatively recently, many suburbs across New Zealand's urban areas looked more or less like this. But the face of our suburbs is changing. So in 2020, the government implemented the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, and that was to remove restrictive barriers to growth both up and out. And essentially, this document heralded a movement towards higher density living. And accompanying the policy statement was the National Medium Density Design Guide, which contained a lot of useful information on how to do these medium density builds. But the design guide contains very, very little information on how to integrate biodiversity into these medium density builds. So moving to medium density means cramming a whole lot more dwelling units into an area. So there could be as many as 30, 50, or even over 200. And inevitably, this results in a massive loss of green space. And this image illustrates the difference between an older suburb on the left and a newer medium density suburb with standalone houses on the right. In New Zealand, probably the majority of medium density is done in the form of townhouses. So our team, of course, we acknowledge that we need a lot more housing in New Zealand, but we feel that in terms of biodiversity, medium density developments often could do better. And so we evaluated a whole range of different developments of different sizes and different housing densities, and we looked at the amount and the quality of the green space that was in those developments. And one of the things that we found was that even when you're comparing developments where the housing density is exactly the same, there was still a lot of variation in terms of the quality of the biodiversity in those developments. So some of them were actually very good, but others were not so good. So I guess many people might believe that biodiverse living environments are a nice to have rather than an essential. But in fact, there is a lot of compelling evidence that suggests otherwise. I mean, for a start, biodiversity underpins ecosystem services, and we rely on these, but we often take them for granted. Although in the case of the regulating services such as flood control or erosion control, their relevance, I guess, has been highlighted recently by some of the climate-related events in the North Island. For urban dwellers, cultural services are particularly important as well. And there's now a huge body of literature that supports the connection between nature contact and well-being. And that well-being is both psychological well-being, but also physical well-being. And contact with nature also enables the development of nature connection in individuals, and that's also been associated with well-being. In fact, a recent study showed that nature connection was as equally important as income in determining life satisfaction. And there are some indirect ways that we can benefit from nature contact. And an example is that patients in hospitals that have a window view looking out on greenery actually recover faster and require shorter hospital stays. And tree cover, I mean, not only is that really important for shade, but it's been associated with better academic performance, to the extent that when my sons were at university and they were sitting exams, I used to tell them that they should go for a walk in the Botanic Gardens before they sat their exams. Of course, I don't know how effective that was. Go back a step. When I talk about diverse native vegetation or good quality vegetation, what I'm talking about is a diversity of species, predominantly mostly native, preferably, but also vegetation that has a diverse structure. So it's planted at various heights, because each of those different heights support different communities of wildlife. And also, we shouldn't forget what happens below ground, because if you have diverse vegetation above ground, then you have a diverse microbiome in the soil, and this microbiome really supports plant growth. But particles from the soil microbiome and the vegetation are contributing to something called bioaerosols, which are in the air that we breathe in. And these are also important for human health. So bioaerosols, the beneficial ones at least, are comprised of non-pathogenic bacteria, fungal spores, and other organic compounds derived from plants. So if you have structurally diverse native vegetation above ground, then you have a really diverse microbiome in the soil, you have a diverse bioaerosols in the air, and then that means that people that live in those environments actually have a much more diverse gut microbiome, and that contributes to our health in a number of ways, and including improved immunoregulation, so reduced prevalence of things like allergies or other diseases related to immune function. So our team also embarked on an evaluation of the policy and the strategy in New Zealand, both at national and regional levels. And what we were looking for is how much biodiversity was supported in our residential environments. And what we found was that, of course, there were policies that supported and recognised the value of these significant natural areas, but there's actually very little that's focused on what is actually in the more modified areas that we find in our immediate living environments. And so given that gap in policy and given the apparent lack of information available, we've created a whole bunch of resources that are designed to assist urban professionals that are interested in incorporating more biodiversity in developments. One of those is the design guide, but we're not going to talk about that today because that's going to be the subject of an upcoming webinar. But we have also created a number of evaluation tools, and Jacqui's going to be talking about those now. Thank you, Jacqui.
Thank you, Yolanda. Tēnā koutou katoa. Yeah, today I will be talking about the New Zealand Biodiversity Factor and Garden Star. So let's get started with the New Zealand Biodiversity Factor. The New Zealand Biodiversity Factor is a suite of tools to assess the biodiversity value of residential, commercial and services, transport and individual building developments. All tools that we have created within our team have the foundation of the biodiversity sensitive urban design principles. These principles were created by Australian researchers in 2018, and I'm just going to take you through them bit by bit. So the first principle is to maintain and introduce habitat. That can be achieved through the installation and planting of a bunch of different species of vegetation in different heights. We also want to make sure that we support dispersal opportunities for wildlife. Imagine you're a bird and you fly over an urban area. Predominantly urban areas or city centers are made up of grey impermeable surfaces. So you need to make sure to incorporate things where birds are happy to rest. That can be achieved through the installation of green roofs or the planting of trees that reach a height above 5 meters. Minimizing human disturbance is really important. One thing are streetlights. I will talk about that in a moment. But we always advocate for more messy gardening practices. So the least disturbance there is, the better. We want to trap for predators. use less pesticides, for example, as well. And we want to support natural ecological processes, for example, pollination or the absorption of stormwater in natural ways. So once these 4 principles are in place, we can also strengthen that human-nature connection. Today, I will be focusing on the New Zealand Biodiversity Factor Residential, which is the tool for housing subdivisions. A lot of the categories are similar between the tools. So what the assessor or end user needs to be able to use the tools is really just the landscape design plans and the development plans, because we do ask a few questions about the square meters of, for example, vegetation present within each plan. There are 3 categories in total. So the first category relates to the permeable area extent. How much of the subdivision is permeable versus impermeable, green versus gray. The second category looks at the street features. For example, the street lights. Artificial light at night has the potential to disrupt circadian rhythm, predator-prey behaviors, or invertebrate community changes. In very general terms, we do say that the more yellow the light is, the better it is for biodiversity. So try to avoid the really bright white light. Other specifications can also be used. For example, light can be directed down onto the ground where it's really needed. For the transport tool in particular, we do have a few more characteristics weaved into that section. For example, you may choose to plant trees that grow to a height higher than cars. So if birds fly over the street, they fly at a higher height than cars and are less likely to be hit, for example. The last category is deemed the most important category because that's really relating to all the vegetation that will be planted, and it relates to future growth of that vegetation from ground cover up to over 5 meters in height, and whether or not the vegetation is native or exotic. Once all the data has been entered, the end user receives a biodiversity factor score out of 100 and tailored recommendations on how to increase biodiversity in ecologically meaningful ways. I'm just going to show you on a real-world example how these tools work. So here we have a pre-development site. We do suggest to use the tools pre and post-development. So this is the site for housing subdivision. As you can see, it's all permeable. There are no streets present, so there's no landscape fragmentation. However, the vegetation that is there is all exotic. So even the shrubs that are there were exotics, and everything else is just exotic grasses or paddock grass. Nevertheless, the biodiversity factor score is 63 points. As you can see, permeable area extent and street features reached full scores. The vegetation category, however, there's definitely room to improve because it was all exotics and there wasn't really any height layers present. Post-development, this is the subdivision that was put in. So first off, unfortunately, the permeable area extent dropped by 67%. However, what they have done really well is they have incorporated a wetland with lots of native vegetation surrounding it, which is fantastic. The green spaces in the residential area can be improved. So there's lots of lawns below 10 centimeters in height, and the streetlights that were incorporated, they didn't meet the specifications. So that led to a biodiversity factor of 42 points, so it dropped by 20 points. As you can see, permeable area extent, I just explained, dropped by 67%. Street features, room to improve. Vegetation, however, increased a little bit because of that wetland and because of the native vegetation that was put in that area. So all the things I have just talked about can easily be incorporated into your own backyards. So I will briefly talk about Garden Star, which is a tool that assesses the biodiversity value of private gardens. It has a few categories, actually 4 in total, with the first category, again, being the permeable area extent category. So of your private property, how much of the area is permeable, green versus gray, impermeable? And what kind of vegetation is there? Again, we're looking at these height layers and whether or not the vegetation is native versus exotic. Ground covers are really important as well. Do you have lots of bare soil? Do you have bark? Do you use loose stone for landscaping? All these things need to be considered. In terms of management, we have a look at whether or not you supply native nectar-producing plants to attract native birds and insects, Do you have sugar water feeders, lizard habitats? Do you not use pesticides? If you have a cat, how do you manage the cat? Is the cat mostly indoors? And the last category for Garden Star is the context category. So we're really looking at the wider neighborhood. Do you have street trees present in your neighboring streets? Are they exotic? Are they native? How far away are you from a vegetation patch and from trees above 5 meters height? And within your green space, what's the clustering like? Do you have clusters of shrubs of different heights that might support dispersal even more? So that is Garden Star. And I realize this session is very short and we do have a lot of tools out there. So we will be running webinars on each of the tools where we go into more depth. And we will be launching each tool, including the design guide, online very soon. They will all be free to use. We do have a Facebook account and Instagram account and LinkedIn account for People, Cities, Nature. And of course, we also have our website. But if you go back to work and you still have questions after that webinar, please feel free to contact either Yolanda and myself as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jacqui and Yolanda. That was so fascinating. I really enjoyed that. And we have plenty of time for questions now. So please put your questions into the Q&A box and I can read them out. But I'm going to start with a question for Jacqui. Yolanda kind of mentioned it as well about ways to get more biodiversity into residential areas, and one of them is by looking at buildings. Is there anything you can tell us about how to get more biodiversity in our built structures and what that might look like?
Yes, sure. I realize I haven't really touched on that at all. So there's lots we can do to incorporate biodiversity into building envelopes. We can incorporate living walls or lots of climbers along walls. We can create green roofs. With green roofs, it's really important to have deep soil levels because that way we can plant plants that reach a higher height, which again is really helpful for dispersal. Now with office buildings nowadays, a lot of them have a lot of glazing. So it's really important to consider bird window collisions. So there are certain strategies you can incorporate to minimize that risk as well. So these are just some of the things that we're looking at for the building tool as well.
So what would be, okay, sorry, I'd just seen a question come up. Are you familiar with the work of Brad Lancaster in Tucson, Arizona? That's about factoring in hydraulic neutrality or harvesting rainwater for urban areas.
I am not familiar with him personally, but I will look him up. I just saw you posted, he's got a TED Talk as well, I believe. I can't actually see all the questions, which is a little weird. But yeah, in terms of rainwaters, we didn't have time to talk about everything, but we do take stormwater solutions into account in all our tools. I think that's really important to mention, but I will definitely look him up. So thank you for that. Yolanda, do you know about him or no?
Another of our questions kind of hints at the water side of things. That the tool sounds great for terrestrial biodiversity, but is there consideration for aquatic ecosystems and incorporating that into your biodiversity score?
We do have water features present, so we do give points depending on whether or not there's a wetland present or a river that flows through a development, for example. Oftentimes, in terms of wetlands, another category that kicks in is to determine if it's a significant restoration, in which case there are slightly different guidelines as well. but we don't have biodiversity components specifically related to aquatic wildlife. Yolanda, do you want to?
Yeah, I'd like to add that I mentioned that we produced a design guide that we also didn't talk about this because it's the subject of another webinar. But the design guide has a lot of different strategies, and they include ones which are focused more on freshwater environments.
That's awesome. Thank you. Our next question is on ideas to improve existing suburbs with no street trees.
I guess one thing that can be done, so no street trees, but the question then is, are berms present? Because a lot of the time streets do have berms present, in which case the lawns could be, for example, either not mowed, that's already a huge benefit, but ideally you have more complex vegetation planted, like little shrubs, or even, ground cover, native ground cover. Invertebrates really love that. Yeah. Yolanda, do you?
Yeah, I mean, the tool is more designed to support people who are in the process of designing something new rather than retrofitting something that exists. Although, of course, there's a lot of information in it that would support retrofitting. But ideally, I guess we should be retrofitting streets with street trees. I guess also if the street itself is without any kind of opportunities for increasing biodiversity, then maybe the private green space or the gardens that along the side of the street, then they could actually be making a significant contribution if everyone was just making some small changes to how they manage their garden.
Yeah, that's a really important part about the collective impact of gardeners and homeowners in cities, that what you do in your backyard, when you all put it together, it can actually have quite a big impact. On that topic, there's obviously a lot of people here who want to see more biodiversity in cities. This is a question from Kitty Wallace, but are there any opportunities for financial support, organisations that people can tap into to support their efforts in building more biodiversity? For example, rates relief, restoration funding, or lowered insurance premium. Are you aware of anything that ticks those boxes?
I'm not aware of anything like that, but it's not something that I've specifically searched for. So it's quite possible that different councils might have rates relief schemes, but the Dunedin City Council doesn't.
And I'm only aware of biodiversity funds. Some councils may have some biodiversity funds, but that's really for community groups that do more planting rather than in urban centres.
Yeah, that sounds kind of crazy when you think of the list of benefits that you have listed in your presentation today. So many good things that come to cities from biodiversity, and there should certainly be some ways of incentivizing a bit more of that. Another question here from Adam Purcell, which is playing devil's advocate. All of the benefits that you mentioned, is there any evidence that those will come from only native vegetation versus exotic, or is there promoting native planting simply for biodiversity value?
That's a really great question. We do get that question every time. So we do acknowledge that even exotic vegetation is really important. It can increase habitat. It can support dispersal opportunities for wildlife, of course, as well. However, on an island nation like New Zealand, most of our wildlife has actually co-evolved with native vegetation. So if the goal is to increase our own biodiversity, it does make sense to have predominantly native vegetation. And there's a lot of research that actually shows when native plants are planted, then the microbiome in the soil is more diverse compared to exotic vegetation. That is right. But in terms of habitat and dispersal opportunities or nesting, yeah, then exotic vegetation is, of course, important as well. Yolanda, do you want to extend?
Yeah, and in the evaluation tools, people get points for exotic vegetation. They just get more points for native vegetation, and it is a really interesting topic. And I think maybe I saw that there's a webinar coming up on bioaerosols from our soils team. So maybe you could ask them that question, and they may be better informed about it, because it's not something that specifically that Jacqui and I know a lot about. But I think, we're promoting native vegetation for a number of different reasons. And part of those is just the value of a sense of place. So having native vegetation really supports that sense of place that people have, which contributes to wellbeing as well. But as Jacqui said, also there is some evidence that suggests that there are specific benefits related to native vegetation, both for the wildlife and for other knock-on effects.
I think one final question from me would be, what would be your dream to see these tools implemented in cities in New Zealand? Like, how would you like to see people embrace them and use them?
I guess for me personally, I would like them incorporated into policy, because right now it's really up to the individual to incorporate biodiversity into urban design. And if even just the use of tools was incorporated into policy, or even just individual councils that have sometimes big building projects going on, that would be amazing. Yeah, that's my vision. How about you?
Yeah, I agree with Jacqui, but also I'd quite like to see there being a national accreditation. Like we have a Green Star accreditation for sustainable houses, sustainable building. That's through the sorry, I can't remember the name. The New Zealand Green Building Council. Is that correct, Jacqui?
Yeah.
And I think it would be great if our tools could just be adopted as supporting an accreditation system, so that when people are actually advertising or selling developments, that they can say, we have this accreditation which shows that, we have incorporated as much biodiversity as we can into this development.
Yeah, it would be amazing to see a bit more of a shift towards biodiversity-friendly practices in urban spaces. Check out the chat for a few links that people have posted for some local opportunities for funding in the Bay of Plenty and Hamilton. So there may be some local opportunities if you need support for increasing the biodiversity in your backyard or in your residential area. So just one final thank you to Yolanda and Jacqui for their kōrero and for all the work that you've done on these tools. We definitely want to see more biodiversity in our cities, and it's clear that there are so many benefits that come from that. So thank you, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. We really hope that this session has been useful to you, and if it has piqued your interest, as Jacqui mentioned, there will be more detailed webinars coming up on the use of those tools, including the design guide that we've mentioned too. Our next webinar in this series is in March, and that will cover some of our research on urban birds. So make sure you're subscribed to our webinar mailing list to hear when the registration link goes live for that. Thank you again for being with us, and until next time, kia pai tō rā.